Hello again, everyone. I'm happy to be back with you today. It's our very last lecture of the whole summer term. It's very difficult for me to believe that we've spent 10 weeks together, but I'm excited about what we've accomplished, and I've been looking forward to getting this last lecture too. Thank you for holding tight and bearing with me as I tried to get this posted for you. I apologize that it's coming a little later in the day than usual. But I did have a deadline that I had to meet for my upcoming fall classes, and so that was the priority early in the day, and so after that I shifted the focus to planning and preparing for tonight's lecture. I am happy to finally have it ready to go, and I'm excited to dive in here. Now, just a few procedural announcements before we delve into the topic of the day. Do keep in mind that your final Week 10 project is due on Sunday. This is the last assignment, not only major assignment, but really the last assignment of the whole summer term. As I said in the weekly announcement this morning, this particular assignment is worth the largest portion of your entire grade for the class. And so if you're wanting to pull your grade up, this particular project is going to be very important for doing so. On the flip side, if you feel that you've been coasting with an A or an A minus and you want to kind of just blow it off, don't do that, because this essay can still damage your grade very significantly, no matter how high it is right now. And so put your all into it. I was pretty pleased with the PowerPoint presentations that I read, and it looked like you all did good work on them. So I have a deep feeling of optimism that I'm going to enjoy seeing your final project and the fruit of your labors from the research presentation. So let's go ahead and dive in here. In our last lecture, you may remember that we considered the philosophy of progressivism, especially as it was relayed in the writings and ideas of John Dewey. He wrote an essay entitled The Future of Liberalism that we considered in some detail last week. You may recall that one of the main themes of that essay had to do with Dewey's effort to invent a new way of thinking about liberty that would be much more consistent with his vision of an active government. Today we are going to explore the political thought of Franklin Roosevelt, and we will see how it represents one of the most thorough embodiments of the progressive philosophy of government. Many of the same concerns that moved John Dewey, we will see also animated the life and ideas of President Franklin Roosevelt. You may recall him from history as our only president who served 4 different terms in office. This was an accomplishment that was so unique, in fact, that after FDR, Congress and the states ratified a constitutional amendment prohibiting more than 2 terms for each president. So one legacy of FDR is the term-limited presidency, because he was so powerful and so popular that Congress felt that some limits had to be imposed on this. He's known as the World War II president. He's the man who shifted the emphasis to helping Great Britain and emphasizing the need to defeat the Nazis and to even ally against a traditional American enemy, the Soviet Union, in order to do so. We're going to abstract a little bit today from the historical role of FDR, the statesman, which is probably well known to many of you. And we're not even going to focus all that much on the particular policies and programs of the New Deal. To be sure, some of that will come up. But ultimately, what is important to consider here is the animating principles, the core ideas that went into the New Deal and what it meant. we're going to see here that this is where the New Deal, at the level of theory, ultimately represents a major departure from the political principles of the American founding. In many ways, we may consider the New Deal as the greatest triumph of the progressive movement. He was, of all the progressives, the most successful at institutionalizing the progressive agenda. So our lecture today will give us a sense of what that agenda was, what it meant to FDR. So the first thing to understand is that, like John Dewey, Franklin Roosevelt believes that the old understanding of American first principles is now at best a liability, and at worst, it's a threat that has to be overcome. The old American principles focused on the need for a limited government that protected unalienable rights against an overbearing state. But the new principles have to focus on something else. We can no longer see individual liberty simply as liberty against a powerful state and the threat of a government. Rather, we need to reconceive individual liberty as something that requires a powerful government in order to confront and challenge the real threat to the individual, which in our time, FDR says, is big business. And so ultimately, government, rather than being our enemy, becomes our friend in the political thought of FDR, much like his contemporary John Dewey. So John Dewey and FDR are both in essential agreement about the core progressive philosophy. Both of them believe that big government, rather than being a threat, is now the pressing need of our time. And yet there are some interesting differences to consider. Even though Dewey and FDR are trying to accomplish essentially the same thing, which is to say a shift away from the limited government assumptions of the American founding and political practice in the United States until the 1930s, the means that they choose to employ and that they emphasize are somewhat different. Much of this can be chalked up to their different backgrounds. Dewey is, of course, an intellectual. His home is the university and the teaching podium. FDR, however, is a practical politician, a very successful one, I might add, who knows how to win elections and is going to do whatever he can to do that. Dewey, therefore, as kind of an Ivy League intellectual, he can afford to wax openly about the deficiencies of old understandings of individual liberty. He can be very clear with us about the extent of his sympathy with socialistic movements. In fact, he was in the Future of Liberalism essay we looked at last week. Remember, for instance, that he praised the radical movements of Europe, which included not only socialism and communism, but also fascism. And he said that their problem was not really the things they were trying to do, it was the way they were going about doing it. Dewey argued that the radical ends of equality and state control of the economy, these were things that had to be accomplished in a more scientific and gradualist way. But nonetheless, that's a very radical kind of statement that he's surprisingly open about. FDR, as a politician and as a public figure, he's going to have to be more circumspect about what he says on the campaign trail. He knows that if he's going to be successful as the face of the United States, he has to present himself as a mainstream politician, one who is deeply attuned to the broader American political tradition and who is not deviating from that tradition, but is just trying to make it work for us in an era that has been troubled by the cratering economy of the Great Depression. Remember the challenge of the time. Remember that the Great Depression, which hit in the 1920s, late 20s, 1929, this depression put about a third of the American people out of work. Unemployment became a fact of life rather than this kind of abstract problem that may or may not ever happen to you. No, prosperity was at an end. This was a calamitous economic crisis. And FDR knows that the time is ripe for a transformative political leader to use this crisis to effect major changes in the way Americans think about and practice American government. FDR is very successful at establishing a new order with the New Deal in light of this Great Depression. And one thing that he did was, rather than simply come out swinging against and openly attacking the American founding, as earlier progressives like John Dewey and Woodrow Wilson sometimes did, FDR is a little more subtle about his intentions. And he, on the surface of things, seems to be more positive about the founding. And so what FDR does is in some ways more, this is a little too negative of a word for maybe what FDR is trying to do, but it's somewhat deceptive. What I mean by this is FDR is taking our image of the founding, and he wants to infuse it with a new meaning that is more compatible with activist government. That way, when Americans vote for him, and when Americans talk about economic rights and an economic New Deal and all these things that he's discussing, they see themselves as doing nothing that the founders themselves would not have done had they lived in the 1930s. And so he is accomplishing something of a rhetorical sleight of hand here. He makes use of very powerful images and symbols from the American political tradition, and he gives to them a meaning that is much more progressive in its basic character, one that is more consistent with this new understanding of liberty that was described by Dewey and that we're going to see further elaborated upon by FDR. So, what is the significance of all this for us today? Well, by changing the way Americans thought about their own founding, and by making limited government principles less important to us, FDR helped to launch a new conception of politics. And it is a conception that has proved remarkably resilient in our own time. Remember that the beginnings of the federal welfare state are in FDR's presidency, with the establishment of the Social Security system and aid for families with dependent children. Prior to his presidency, the care for the poor and the disadvantaged was generally handled by local and state governments when government played a role. So it's a myth that governments nowhere did anything. No, the difference is not that the difference between FDR and his predecessors is that most believed that it was not the responsibility of the federal government specifically, but the state governments to handle problems related to poverty because they were closer to the problem. But oftentimes, care for the poor was handled not even by government, but sometimes by churches and local private associations. FDR, in a direct challenge to this consensus, launches an idea of economic rights. These are rights that are economic benefits given to you by the state. They are not rights that protect you against government power, but they are economic benefits that government guarantees to you. And so we're going to describe this as we look through the Commonwealth Club address and then briefly go over the Second Bill of Rights concept. Additionally, the vast regulatory bureaucracy that we know today as the administrative state has its roots in FDR's presidency. Ronald Reagan once said famously that the scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Well, to Reagan, what was a set of scary words is, in FDR's mind, much more of something that we should long for. We should long for government to come to our aid and come to help us. And the most important and indispensable item to do this is a powerful administrative state full of bureaucrats. So earlier progressives had some modest accomplishments in this area. Presidents such as Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson undoubtedly played a role in establishing some of the first administrative agencies that were intended to regulate capitalism and impose new rules and regulations on American private life. The early progressives envisioned a powerful bureaucracy that would be independent of political control and isolated from elected politics. Elections and politics were tied, to the progressive mind, with political parties, corruption, and self-interest. To the progressives, what was needed was a bureaucracy that would be free of political control. It needed to be a fourth branch of government rather than a part of the government that was strictly subordinate to political control in the executive branch. And so today, when we often hear claims that Trump is posing an existential crisis to democratic norms because he is firing bureaucrats in some of the administrative departments. Well, while there are certain criticisms of Trump that are fair, and even criticisms that are appropriate with respect to his view of executive power, well, this particular criticism shows a indebtedness not to constitutional thinking, but to New Deal thinking. The administrative state was never intended to be a check and balance against the president. But today, when Trump tries to rein in bureaucracy, it is seen as a challenge to democracy. So what was the progressive mindset here? Well, the progressives hated the fact that in the old days, the Gilded Age, new presidents could come on in and they could totally shake up the bureaucracy. They could fire all the old appointees and replace them with their own people. So, for instance, Benjamin Harrison, the Republican, leaves office. Well, Grover Cleveland comes in and he just fires every single person in the executive branch that Harrison had originally appointed. Well, what does this do? Well, the progressives said it prevents the bureaucracy from becoming this stable and independent body that can make decisions based on expertise that are no longer really consistent with or accountable to the consent of the governed. FDR's presidency is not where these theories are first invented, because they were already prominent in the thought of these early progressives. But what FDR does is he really actualizes these things at the level of political practice in a way that the earlier progressives were not as successful at doing. During FDR's presidency, the bureaucracy radically expanded, and the administrative state really just became a fact of life rather than a pure theory. Consider that there were literally millions of new bureaucrats who were given government jobs during the New Deal. And, to top it off, they were provided with civil service protections that made it impossible for future presidents to fire them. The isolation of the bureaucracy from presidential control, which was a major part of FDR's legacy, ended up causing all kinds of problems for several conservative presidents, including Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and Donald Trump, who, despite all their differences in many other directions, nonetheless saw themselves as challenging the bureaucracy and some of the entrenched elite leadership of that time. When FDR took office in 1933, there were 1.5 million federal bureaucrats in the whole executive administrative department. But by the time FDR died in 1945, there were 3.5 million. So just think of that, an expansion of 2 million federal jobs. Not just federal jobs, federal bureaucratic jobs. All kinds of new regulators and elites in the bureaucracy. Well, many of these bureaucracies, alphabet soup agencies, as some critics of the New Deal sometimes called them, are still with us today, including the FDIC, the SEC, and the SSA. Many others were declared unconstitutional or phased out over time and simply assimilated into new government agencies down the road. But at the end of the day, FDR's legacy with respect to the administrative state is seemingly insurmountable. The administrative state seems to just be a part of his legacy that's here with us to stay. Other parts of the FDR legacy are also profoundly important, such as his handling of World War II and his effort to create a liberal internationalist world order. But they are beyond the scope of today's lecture. His influence with respect to how we understand individual freedom and the free enterprise system give us ample room for discussion today. In some ways, the very extent of FDR's success has made it impossible to go back completely to the strictly limited federal government that prevailed before his rise to power. And yet, his success has not been completely unchallenged. As we're going to consider later in the lecture, today there is a new suspicion of the administrative state and even his liberal internationalist legacy that might portend challenges to the New Deal legacy. But at the same time, there are also would-be heirs to the New Deal legacy. Progressive liberals such as Barack Obama have argued that FDR's work has to be finished in our generation, and they relied on the language of the New Deal, especially the language of economic rights, in order to justify policies like Obamacare, universal health care for all, which we will see is rooted in FDR's concepts about government. So in today's lecture, we're going to start by considering the philosophy of the Commonwealth Club address, and then move to see how this philosophy is given its most triumphal expression in FDR's call for a second Bill of Rights. So most of the discussion today will focus on the Commonwealth Club speech. This is probably the most famous speech that FDR delivered in the 1930s. His first inaugural is perhaps on par with it, but at least at the level of political philosophy, this one is the most substantive of all of his speeches. One thing that is immediately important in this speech is the significance of the setting. Notice who he is speaking to. He is speaking to the Commonwealth Club address, or the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, California. This was a long-time progressive association that had a long heritage of calling for reform and for other policies that connected to the progressive movement of the early 1900s. Well, FDR is speaking to this progressive haven, and he's doing so in the West to an audience in the city of San Francisco as well as the state of California. Even in this day, California and especially San Francisco were very much attuned with the progressive movement. They were much more liberal in the policies that they supported than many of the other states in the Union were. FDR is aware of this. He says that this is a place, in his words here, he says, that has the great potentialities of youth, and in particular is this true of the Great West and of this coast and of California. Now, his opening here, where he points to the significance of the setting, it foreshadows important themes in this speech. The West and the image of the frontier that it evokes to us are going to be very significant themes within this speech. Part of his argument is that progressivism has a natural home within the West because of this region's newness and its receptivity to change. There's something about Western culture, he believes, and I mean here Western United States culture, he believes, that's going to make possible a new kind of individualism. And so, unsurprisingly, with this idea of newness at its core, the very first working title of the Commonwealth Club speech was actually called The New Individualism. And so we see here how consistent this is with Dewey. FDR wants to convey that the old individualism is broken and that a new kind of individual liberty is necessary in order to face the challenges of our times. You may have noticed when you read through this speech that it's unusually philosophical, despite its character as a 1932 campaign address. Well, there is a real reason for this. This speech was intended to be the most important statement of FDR's larger political philosophy. It was meant to be his political testimony to the American people. One of FDR's campaign advisors and one of the principal speechwriters of this address, Adolph Burley, was worried about the possibility that FDR could inadvertently repeat history in a bad way by losing the election and leaving behind no statement of his political philosophy for future generations of progressive Democrats to look at and glean insights from. Now, remember the context here, 1932. Republicans have presided over the Great Depression. Hoover's re-election looks increasingly unlikely, given the immense calamity of the economy, of the economic crash, as well as Hoover's apparent ineptness at keeping the public confidence in his handling of the economic crash. And so Hoover's re-election looks unlikely. And yet FDR's advisors were not complacent. They understood that Democrats had lost 3 consecutive presidential elections, 1920, 1924, and 1928. And so their success in 32, even with the Depression, was not assured. They understood that in these earlier elections, Democratic candidates like James Cox and Al Smith failed to leave behind any kind of statement that spoke to their overarching philosophy of government. There was no real great speech you could point to from the 1924 campaign in order to understand exactly what John W. Davis, for example, the candidate in 1924, believed about government. You know, they gave stump speeches and whatnot, but there was no systematic statement of their political philosophy anywhere. There was no speech you could point to from Smith or Davis or Cox that could really lay out in crystal clear language what their principles were and why they were relevant for future generations. FDR wants to be different. He wants to make it so that even if he loses the election, he's giving the American people a speech that future generations of liberal progressives can look back on and point to in order to explain what it means to be a Democrat. So you can see here he wants to put his stamp on the minds of future liberal and progressive Democrats. He wants to make sure that even if he loses, he's going to shape their mind in some way. Now, with the benefit of retrospect, we know that FDR won the election and it was a blowout. It wasn't even close. And he goes on to win 3 more presidential elections in huge landslides. Well, that speech has still continued to serve that same purpose that he had envisioned. It has become a very important source for historians and political scientists as they have sought to understand the ideas that moved Roosevelt and defined the New Deal. So, getting into the ideas directly, one of the first things you'd notice as you read through this speech is that there is a very powerful notion of history that is pervasive throughout this speech. And this is typical of progressive thought. Remember that historicism is a philosophy that holds that all people are moved by the spirit of their age. Historical contingency is what guides all ideas. And so it's not ultimately the ideas that are shaping history, it's the history that is shaping the ideas. And so slaves to history is one way of thinking about this. But history also has a current, it has a purpose, it has a direction that it is pushing people. And for the progressives, that purpose is the creation of a more egalitarian and democratic state. It's moving us along to fulfill that purpose. And so the enemies of reform are being left behind by the progress of history. These enemies, the barons of feudalism, the federalists of the old republic, and in FDR's time, you would say the big business leaders. These people are on the wrong side of history, which is a term that the left still uses even today. And so FDR is confident that history is on his side and that there is a kind of spirit of history that can justify the new ideas of his age. And so there's a historicist interpretation of the American founding here, where he does appeal to certain elements of the founding. But at the end of the day, it's really the progress of history that is guiding the founders more than anything else. It's not really the ideas of the founders. And so the first important conflict from history that FDR uses is from the ancient past, much more distant than the founding. Actually, he goes all the way back to feudalism. This image, this conflict that he describes, it sets the tone for what is to follow. And it immediately establishes the overarching agenda of the New Deal project. So he uses this image of the conflict between the barons and the lords of feudal times, and the peasants and the serfs who served them. In this conflict, as he presents it, the barons were often the big fish in a small pond. They were able to treat their serfs as they found most appropriate. There was a relative decentralization of power, where a bunch of barons just ruled their little vicinities, and there was no overarching sovereign state or single political government to get in their way or hold them in line. FDR puts it this way in the Commonwealth Club speech. He says, "When we look about us, we are likely to forget how hard people have worked to win the privilege of government." So notice how he puts it. Government is a privilege. The growth of the national governments of Europe was a struggle for the development of a centralized force in the nation, strong enough to impose peace upon ruling barons. In many instances, the victory of the central government and the creation of a strong central government was a haven of refuge to the individual. The people prefer the master far away to the exploitation and cruelty of the smaller master near at hand. And so notice what he's doing here. As FDR sees it, the rise of the powerful absolute monarchies in Europe, Louis XIV, I am the state, these kinds of guys. These absolute monarchs weren't so bad because they brought an end to the rule of the feudal barons. And they were actually a force for the progress of history. It was their accomplishment and their imposition of uniformity on these unruly barons that made possible the rise of the modern state. And FDR, as he's very clear here, says this modern state, government, it's a privilege to be appreciated. It's not a threat that demands limitation. And so the implications for the New Deal are pretty obvious, right? He sees a parallel between the leaders of the great businesses of his own day, the princes of property, as he puts it later in the speech, and the barons of feudalism. FDR, by implication, may see something of a resemblance between himself and the absolute monarchs, the Louis XIVs and the others, who brought an end to the rule of the barons and created a unitary, centralized, and modern state that was guided by their leadership. What FDR doesn't tell us explicitly here is that a necessary casualty of this, if it is to be effected, has to be the Constitution. We explored in some detail the overarching principles of the Constitution, and without spending time on reviewing that, you hopefully learned that the founders actually were trying to create a pretty decentralized system that dispersed power to the states. They wanted a federal government that strictly limited governmental power, not that made it easier for government to do things all the time. And so you can see that the stage is set immediately for a conflict between traditional views about constitutional government and FDR's advocacy for an almost monarchical kind of leadership. This image of the barons that he uses, it sets up for his next discussion, which is the image of the founding. The growth of the modern state that eventually gave rise to rulers who were not so public-spirited. And what ended up happening was history presented an answer to this problem. History presented a new ethical dimension to government, which said that rulers ought to work for the people. This is the philosophy that guided the American Revolution. The Revolution was an outgrowth of this conflict between the absolute monarchy viewpoint on the one hand, and a more liberal perspective on the other hand that said that no, rulers have duties to the people. But in American history, this conflict also had to be worked out. It played out in such a way as between those who feared the people, FDR says, and those who embraced the people. He's pretty clear about who he believes took which side at the time of the early Republic. Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists on one side of the aisle were said to have feared popular government, whereas Thomas Jefferson and the Anti-Federalists, or the later Republican Party of Jefferson, not to be confused with the Republican Party of Lincoln, they took the side of the people against government. And so notice how FDR puts Hamilton's perspective. FDR says that the Federalists under Hamilton's leadership believed that the safety of the Republic lay in the autocratic strength of its government, that the destiny of individuals was to serve that government, and that fundamentally a great and strong group of central institutions, guided by a small group of able and public-spirited citizens, could best direct all government. And so notice this is not Hamilton, the author of the Federalist Papers, that gives us a pretty thorough and philosophical analysis of the principles of checks and balances and constitutional liberty. No, this is an autocrat. And in the same way, he offers a depiction of Thomas Jefferson that arguably plays fast and loose with the history. Thomas Jefferson, as FDR presents him, is a believer in individualism and popular rule. That much is also that much is perfectly fine historically. But notice how he fills in the details here. FDR says Jefferson has no real fixed dogmas about government. As he puts it, government to him was a means to an end, not an end in itself. It might be either a refuge and a help or a threat and a danger, depending on the circumstances. And so what Jefferson really wanted was the right of the people to rule. This did not necessarily entail a limited government. And so he advances this kind of image of Jefferson as an advocate for pragmatic government with a passage from Jefferson's letters, in which Jefferson praises the way farming has prevented a kind of vast disparity of wealth in America. We have a relatively equal society in Jefferson's letter. Well, he uses this letter to suggest that Jefferson would have agreed with a welfare state. And so as he explains, he says, even Jefferson realized that the exercise of property rights might so interfere with the rights of the individual that the government without whose assistance the property rights could not exist must intervene not to destroy individualism, but to protect it. And again, notice here something very key that you can easily miss if you blink. Government without whose assistance property rights could not exist. Are property rights unalienable? Are they rights based off of nature that you have a title to that government cannot change based on the laws of nature? No, not at all. Government is the author of property rights. It is government who makes property rights possible. And so naturally, government can revisit and reevaluate property rights as needed. And so property rights is no longer an unalienable right in this presentation. But not only does FDR advance this perspective, he's imputing it to Thomas Jefferson. And so at best, this image of Jefferson is pretty creative. And at worst, it's a flat-out distortion of the historical record. So notice that this is not the Jefferson who in his first inaugural address said, and this is a direct quote, who said, "That government is best which governs the least." This is also not the Jefferson who defended property rights pretty clearly and said that, quote, "persons and property make the sum of the objects of government." And it is not even the same Jefferson who was the author of the Declaration of Independence, which asserts pretty emphatically and pretty clearly, famously, that the purpose of government is the protection of unalienable rights. No, as FDR has it, limited government and unalienable rights are not really that important to the author of the Declaration of Independence. What Jefferson really cared about was the right of the people to rule against corrupt elites. And today that mission requires an activist government that Jefferson would embrace if he were here today. And so one important thing to remember is that in the passage that Jefferson wrote, which FDR quoted, Jefferson was simply describing a situation that already existed when he praised farming and the equality of conditions in America. And he believed that this equality of conditions was best advanced through states' rights in a very limited government. And so Jefferson was not advocating for a welfare state here, as FDR suggests he was. But nonetheless, simply moving on here, distortions aside and criticisms aside, the conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton was ultimately resolved when Jefferson won the 1800 election. It was this election that assured that individualism would be the watchword of American life, because what was one of the first things Jefferson did? Well, it was the Louisiana Purchase. It was the same purchase which added all of this new land to the United States and made possible the next condition for American individualism. And ultimately, it was this other condition that leads to American individualism as we know it today, much more so than the ideas of the founders. Remember, ideas are not that powerful in the sense that they can be based on eternal philosophical insights. No, historical conditions move ideas. And so Jefferson's election makes possible the Louisiana Purchase and this westward expansion. So the new condition is the frontier. All of a sudden, there's all kinds of unsettled land that we have to make use of in the early 1800s. FDR is here appealing to an image that's very powerful in American culture even today. This is the image of the cowboy, the image of the American West and the frontier. And so this is the day of individualism brought about by the rise of the frontier culture and the cowboy spirit. As he puts it, the day of individualism was, quote, long and splendid because, quote, on the western frontier, land was substantially free. No one who did not shirk the task of earning a living was entirely without an opportunity to do so. And so the message he's trying to relay here is that when you fell on hard times in the 1800s and you lived in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, or one of the other old established cities, all you had to do, FDR says, was get in your wagon, move west, and start a new life for yourself out on the frontier. And so depressions didn't really mean very much back then. You could always just start over and move west. There was a lot of free and available land that needed settlement. and government sometimes even promoted efforts by individuals to do so by selling land at massive discounts. And so all of this furthered the cause of individualism, the old individualism in American life. Remember that the title of this speech was originally The New Individualism. Well, what he's describing here with the frontier, it's the old individualism, right? The one that has to be displaced. So the individuals who moved west and who started a new life for themselves, they believed that they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps and that they were rugged individualists who were able to face challenges and hardship and do it on their own. And they were fearful of authority. To the extent they talked about government, they just wanted it to shut up and leave them alone, right? So think for a moment about a typical Western movie. I like a few of Clint Eastwood's movies, for example. And in those Clint Eastwood movies, you often see him as a classic cowboy figure opposing himself to corrupt sheriffs and other political authorities that stand in the way of the freedom of the West and the frontier. Now, to be sure, Clint Eastwood also goes after bandits and a lot of lawless bad guys, so he's not an anarchist at the end of the day. But ultimately, the cowboy and the culture that it promotes favors something like rugged individualism. To the cowboy, liberty is primarily freedom from government. And so when FDR calls in this speech, a short time later, for a reappraisal of values, what he's calling for is for us to bring an end to the days of the cowboy. The cowboy days are over. And so the freedom of the frontier and the individualism of the West are no longer helpful aids to us. Historical conditions have changed. While there was a place for the cowboy in the 1800s, his moment in history has ended. The reason for this massive change in historical circumstance is, and the very reason that gives shape to his new reappraisal of values, is the closing of the frontier. As America developed, as the population expanded, and as American capitalism grew and produced more and more industry and enterprise, eventually we ran out of land. And so today, even in the West, even the West is widely populated and settled. There's no more unsettled land that you can go to if you want to just start over. California is our biggest state. And I'm sitting here recording this in the city of Denver, which began as one of these sparsely populated frontier towns out in the West, isolated from the established cities of the East. And yet, Denver is a massive city now. There's nowhere to go anymore, FDR is saying. Americans all over the country are close together, no matter where you are. You can no longer just get in your wagon and move west if you fall on hard times and want to start a new life for yourself. And as proximity has brought us closer together, so we feel our problems, so we feel more political problems more consistently, right? When you're in a densely packed area with tons and tons of neighbors, it's more likely that you might have stringent, for example, leash laws restricting pet owners, because in rural areas where land is spread out and you don't have a lot of interaction between people, well, you don't have to worry about that much, because your dog can run around on tons of wide open spaces that are your land and not get on anyone else's property or cause a problem for someone else. Well, all this changes whenever you have this massive crowding in the big cities and the closing of the West. And so what has also happened is that because we can no longer just go and move west and start over if you fall on hard times, income inequality is worsening, and the power of corporations over political life is growing. FDR explains as follows. He says, a glance at the situation today only too clearly indicates that equality of opportunity as we have known it no longer exists. Our industrial plant is built. The problem just now is whether under existing conditions it is not overbuilt. Our last frontier has long since been reached, and there is practically no more free land. And so again, with the closing of the frontier, the days of the cowboy and the old individualism are over. The answer to the problems posed by this closing of the frontier, it's a reappraisal of values. We have to realize, as he puts it, the new terms of the old social contract. In the past, in those cowboy days, for instance, you consented to government to protect your unalienable rights and otherwise stay out of your way. It had a limited purpose. But those days are over. Today, we have to realize a new individualism that demands that we look to government as our friend and not as our enemy. The old focus on individual rights against the state has to give way to a new idea that government is in the business of providing for economic equality and the economic rights of the people. And so the threat to liberty, it's big business. It's not government anymore. There's a new tyranny for a new society. Now, what are the implications of this for the economy? Well, the free enterprise system, as you could imagine, was based on this old individualism. It was based on the idea of freedom against government and limitations on governmental regulation and supervision of the economy. But the new individualism that FDR envisions is based upon a very different conception of government. It is based on the idea that government has to plan and supervise the economy in order to guarantee the economic equality of the people. And so in one of the most important passages of the whole speech, FDR argues that capitalism and free enterprise are actually too efficient. So he doesn't make the criticism that capitalism isn't working because it's not producing enough stuff. No, he goes in the opposite direction. He says, no, capitalism is too efficient. It's producing too many goods. And what America needs today is not more stuff. We need more regulation of the stuff that we already have. And so we need economic planning to regulate the economy. So this is the passage. He says, a mere builder of more industrial plants, a creator of more railroad systems, and organizer of more corporations, is as likely to be a danger as a help. The day of the great promoter, or the financial titan, to whom we granted anything if only he would build or develop, is over. Our task now is not discovery or exploitation of natural resources, or necessarily producing more goods. It is the soberer, less dramatic business of administering resources and plants already in hand, of seeking to reestablish foreign markets for our surplus production, of meeting the problem of underconsumption, of adjusting production to consumption, of distributing wealth and products more equitably, of adapting existing economic organizations to the service of the people. And so, who are, you may be wondering, these economic planners? Who are these people that are going to bring economic equality to the people? Well, he is pretty clear about this. He says that the answer is the administrative state. It is the bureaucracy housed in the federal government. Elite planners and experts within this bureaucracy who are going to be isolated from the ordinary political process are going to bring equality and efficiency to the American economy. As he puts it in a sentence right after this, immediately after that last sentence. I should have included it on the quote here. The day of enlightened administration has come. And so the administrative state is the answer to the problems. It is the key to effectuating this new liberty. And so, as you can imagine, FDR seems to have very little faith in the free enterprise system. And while we may view this as being somewhat fair in light of the problem of the Great Depression? Well, we ought to consider the extent of his arguments against free enterprise here. So he believes that capitalism and free enterprise has been too efficient. It's led to overproduction. And this bears a striking resemblance, I think, to arguments we sometimes hear today. So, for instance, Bernie Sanders, when he was running for president in 2016, had a pretty controversial moment when he condemned American capitalism for giving consumers the choice of 20 different kinds of deodorant. And this is a direct quote. Of 20 different kinds of deodorant at a supermarket while people on the streets are starving. There's my Bernie impression. Not very good, right? I'm not a Bernie bro. So, the capitalist system, it, again, gives consumers the choice of 20 different kinds of deodorant at the supermarket when people on the streets are starving to death. So Bernie Sanders, a socialist, put aside the polemical language, he's making the same argument that FDR is making in a more sophisticated way here. FDR in this speech is saying that capitalism, when it is left to itself, creates too many goods, and it widens economic disparity. And so, wouldn't it be better? So rather than give consumers the choice of 20 different kinds of deodorant at the supermarket, wouldn't it be better to have a planned economy, or even perhaps a command economy, that gives government planners the ability to decide which kinds of deodorant are the least expensive to make and which ones are the most acceptable for the American people, and kind of crushes consumer choice. Because we don't need that many choices, right? Well, that's what he's saying here. Free economies. They give you a lot of choices, but they also make possible economic inequalities. They also make possible this alleged inefficiency and overproduction of resources. And so for FDR, this is just a recipe for oligarchy, for the rule of princes of property against the masses. And so what we need is a big government that protects the people from the corporations and fulfills the terms of the old the new terms of the old social contract, as he puts it. So I want to say something briefly about the Second Bill of Rights, because this is the most important sort of fulfillment of FDR's principled convictions at the level of concrete proposals. What are the implications of the Commonwealth Club address for real policy? Well, he's pretty clear about this here. So at the end of World War II, so this is a 1944 State of the Union address, and at the end of World War II, he reasserts the political theory of the Commonwealth Club address. In this speech, he calls for Congress to ratify a second Bill of Rights. Now, you might hear this and wonder, well, why do we need a second Bill of Rights? What's wrong with the first Bill of Rights? Well, FDR gives us an answer to that question. FDR, in this same speech, says the original Bill of Rights that we studied in this class, this was a Bill of Rights that primarily focused on limited government. It was a Bill of Rights that was about things like freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. In other words, freedoms that government protected simply by leaving you alone. Well, that kind of freedom may be consistent with the old individualism, but it is not with the new. And so FDR calls for the ratification of a second Bill of Rights that's going to be more expansive than the first Bill of Rights ever was. It's going to be a new Bill of Rights that shifts the emphasis away from political rights that are against the government and instead shifts it to economic rights that are guaranteed by the government. This shift is necessary, FDR believes, because, as he puts it, necessitous men are not free men. Or, quote, true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. And so, if you want for something economically, then FDR's argument is that you are not really free, no matter how limited your government is. And so in his second Bill of Rights speech, FDR gives us the following things as economic rights that have to be guaranteed by the government. You have an economic right to your welfare check. You have an economic right to a good-paying job and a decent home. You have an economic right to a good living wage. You have an economic right to health care. You have an economic right to good food, adequate clothing, and even recreation, right? And so he says that in the second point up there. And so all of these different things are guaranteed by a powerful nanny state government. And he never really grapples with important questions that some of us may be asking here, like, well, what does it mean to say that you have a right to adequate recreation? What does it mean to say government has a responsibility to give me the right to recreation? Does government have to pay for my vacation, even if I want it to be as lavish as possible? Maggie and me, my soon-to-be wife, we've been talking about honeymoon ideas, and does FDR's proposal here justify federal money going to me to go to some fancy lavish setting like Venice for a honeymoon, right? I wish I had the money for that, but that doesn't mean government should give it to me. And additionally, other questions. So if government just gives me money all the time to protect me against the anxiety of unemployment, well, why should I ever even work, right? I mean, it's one thing to believe in a kind of safety net that puts you on the path to a job after losing it, but it's a whole other thing to basically suggest that the government has this sort of perpetual responsibility to just always protect you against the anxiety of unemployment by guaranteeing that you still have money coming in no matter what. Additionally, what about this decent home, the right of every family to a decent home? Well, if I like most of the qualities about my home, but maybe I think it doesn't have a few things, right? I love my house, but I wish it had a swimming pool. Well, does that mean government should guarantee that everyone has the exact home they think is decent and that makes them feel good, right? Now, these are sort of silly examples, right? But they strike at the heart of what's going on here and why it is so problematic. Government seems to not have any principled limits for FDR. There doesn't seem to be much of anything that he thinks government shouldn't give to the people if they think it's necessary. And so it's important to remember here that just because something might be desirable to have personally does not mean that it has to be a government-guaranteed right. And so when liberals today, who are following on the heels of FDR and his legacy, say things like, well, healthcare is a human right, they're persisting in the same basic error that guided FDR originally. Where does all the money for these programs actually come from? Is it not the case that the crushing taxes that are necessary to fund these programs for economic equality, might they destroy the prosperity of the economy and discourage people from starting businesses or even from aiming to be successful and to make something of themselves and to leave money to their children, right? I mean, the highest marginal tax rate in FDR's presidency, it was something like 90%, right? And so just think of that. Why would you even want to be a millionaire? Because you can't pass it down to anyone. Many people would simply relocate rather than face the crushing tax burden of this New Deal system. And so these are all important criticisms that have continued to inform conservative opposition to the thinking of FDR and the philosophy behind the nanny state. So I want to wrap up here with just some concluding thoughts, and I won't keep you long because this has already been a lengthy lecture. You probably don't need me to tell you, simply from reading this address, you probably could already tell that at the end of the day, this new individualism and this concept of economic rights that FDR articulates, it spells the end for the principle of limited government. And so it's interesting to consider this because many scholars, many historians especially, like to claim that FDR was a political moderate who just put band-aids on the capitalist system. But when you study FDR, not so much the practical statesman, but the overarching theories that guided him, you see that there's something of a radical and perhaps even socialist edge to his political thought. And this helps us to make sense of the new conception of government that the Commonwealth Club address espouses, and why the philosophy of the American founding seems so foreign to many people today. To many Americans, it just seems bizarre that you would talk about limited government or checks and balances as if these were things that still mattered today. Well, this shows that we're very much today under the spell of FDR. When Barack Obama rallied the country for Obamacare, he said he was simply carrying on FDR's unfinished work and trying to realize one of the core principles of the Second Bill of Rights, which was its call for government-guaranteed health care. And yet, even many Republicans have often failed to make any serious challenges to FDR's political philosophy. Trump in 2024, he campaigned on the need to save Social Security and Medicare and other economic rights. So he didn't necessarily ask citizens to reconsider the philosophy behind the New Deal or to reevaluate its overarching principles. Of all of our post-FDR presidents, it was probably President Reagan that mounted the strongest challenge to the New Deal order. He related its ideas to socialism, and he called for us to reinvigorate the spirit of the old individualism, the spirit of the cowboy, that helped us to face so many challenges and win 2 world wars. And yet, despite Reagan's best efforts, he was unable to leave behind a government that was significantly smaller than the one that he inherited. And this in some ways speaks to just the triumph of FDR. Even a very successful statesman like Reagan could only do so much to reevaluate the New Deal order. And so, as this example illustrates, we have had some Americans question whether or not the end of the old individualism is really true or even desirable. Reagan would say, don't we still depend on that same spirit of exploration, the same spirit of adventure, and the same rugged individualism that once made America great? Even today, don't we depend on that? And is it not the case that when you shift all this power to an unelected administrative state of bureaucrats, in a group of enlightened administrators, will this not lead to the death of this spirit, as citizens find themselves crushed by rules and regulations that make it harder for them to make the most of themselves? These questions that are posed by FDR's political thought and his progressive conception of government will continue to resonate for many years, undoubtedly, especially as we see Trump and other Republicans challenge the administrative state, even if they do not challenge the welfare order. And so thank you all so much for listening to this lecture, our last lecture of the semester. It has truly been a wonderful honor to serve as your professor this summer. I hope you learned a lot from this class and that you're well prepared to continue thinking about politics in the coming years. Remember that at the end of the day, as Ronald Reagan once said in his farewell address, good government begins at the dinner table. It is in the ideas that you relay to your families, that you teach to your children, and make known to your mom and dad, that America will finally find relief in. Elections matter, they really do. But more important than any election, more important even than a presidential election, is the character of the ordinary citizens that make up our country and the society that they try to build in those units that are closest to them. So, as my final words of advice to you, no matter who you are, I say be a good son or a good daughter. Be a good father or a good mother. Be a good teacher or a good student. Be a good worker or a good boss. But above all things, be a good Christian. When we aim for those things, we will make America worthy of our liberty, and we will illustrate all those qualities that made us such a great nation and that can continue to make us a great nation if we put our all into our citizenship. I thank you guys for a wonderful summer, and I wish you a great week and hope to see some of you Thursday. Goodbye, everyone. Thanks again.